So have you ever wondered if the words coming out of your mouth actually change the way your eyes see the world? Welcome to today's Explainer, where we're going to unpack a truly fascinating neuroscience mystery. We're looking at exactly how your brain processes the reality right in front of your eyes, literally milliseconds before you even have a chance to think about it. We're going to explore the absolute cutting edge of visual perception, some intense theoretical tensions going on right now in neuroscience, and a massive plot twist regarding how our language might, or, well, might not, shape what we see.
Here is the central mystery that has hooked researchers for years. Does the language you speak actually change how your brain sees color? And I don't just mean how you describe a beautiful sunset to a friend. I mean, does your vocabulary fundamentally alter your raw, unfiltered visual reality before you even have a single conscious thought about it? If you happen to speak a language that has completely distinct words for different shades of blue, does your visual cortex actually react differently to those specific shades entirely on its own?
To figure this out, scientists look at this really specific electrical signal in the brain called visual mismatch negativity, or vMMN. Think of vMMN as your brain's automatic pre-attentive surprise alarm. It's an electrical wave that spikes incredibly early. We're talking just 100 to 250 milliseconds after you see something. It happens completely under the radar. It's exactly like when you're deeply engrossed in reading a great book, but your brain automatically flinches if a shadow suddenly crosses your peripheral vision. Your conscious mind is busy, but your visual hardware, it's always keeping watch.
So how do we actually trip this surprise alarm in a lab? Researchers use this sneaky little trick called the classic oddball paradigm. First, they lull the brain into a false sense of security. Actually, it's more like they just bore the brain by presenting a frequent, repetitive stimulus. Say, flashing a light blue circle over and over and over again. Then, right when the brain is totally comfortable, they unexpectedly drop in a rare stimulus, like a dark blue circle. Finally, they measure that vMMN spike. It's basically a way to trick your visual cortex into building a subconscious expectation, just so we can break it and measure the fallout.
But here is where the science gets really heated. We've got a massive neural tug-of-war on our hands. Why exactly does the brain generate this flinch, this vMMN signal, in the first place? Neuroscientists have been locked in this intense, high-stakes debate over what this electrical spike actually represents. Are we seeing a highly intelligent, actively predicting brain at work? Or are we just looking at the basic mechanical reality of tired visual circuits?
Let's break down the two heavyweights in this fight. On one side, we have predictive coding. Think of the brain as a crystal ball. This theory argues that your brain is an active prediction machine, constantly building top-down models of the world to minimize surprise. So when a rare visual breaks the pattern, the vMMN is a literal prediction error alarm ringing. On the other side, we have sensory adaptation, or the tired neuron model. Think of this one like a draining smartphone battery. It argues for a bottom-up approach. When you show the exact same image repeatedly, the specific neurons processing it simply get fatigued. When a new image finally appears, fresh, unfatigued neurons fire, which just makes their response look relatively much larger by comparison. Now, the plot thickens dramatically when these theories collide with linguistics. A few years ago, a highly publicized scientific claim dropped an absolute bomb on this debate. Researchers claimed they had found a Whorfian effect, meaning the structure of our language fundamentally shapes our perception. They argued that cognitive language categories directly alter early, raw visual processing. If this were true, no joke, it would be a massive victory for the top-down predictive coding camp. It would mean our higher-level thoughts and vocabulary reach all the way down into our most basic sensory circuits.
This whole claim was based on comparing how different languages categorize color. Take English. We generally just say blue for both light and dark shades. But if you travel to Greece, you'll find they use two distinct basic terms, chalatsio for light blue and bli for dark blue. Russian does the exact same thing with goluboy and sinizh. The original researchers tested Greek and Russian speakers and found that because their languages had distinct fundamental words for these specific shades, their brains seemingly generated a significantly stronger vMMN surprise signal when the shade changed compared to English speakers. This led to a very dramatic conclusion in the scientific literature. I'll read the exact quote directly from this earlier research. The categorical code for color is present at early stages of chromatic processing, even in the absence of top-down modulation from attention. To put that dense science simply, this staggering conclusion suggested that the specific culture and vocabulary you grew up with acts as a literal, hardwired filter for your raw visual data. It implied your dictionary edits your vision before you even know what you're looking at. Crazy, right? But science is a beautifully rigorous process. And here comes the plot twist. Recent, highly rigorous replication studies, including a major paper published in the Proceedings of the National Academy of Sciences, pulled back the curtain on these findings. And they turned this entire scientific theory completely upside down. They discovered a critical methodological disconnect that unraveled the color category claim entirely.
To put the language theory to the ultimate test, modern researchers designed a brilliant conceptual extension specifically for English speakers. Think about our basic color terms. In the cool region of the color wheel, English really only has two main fundamental terms, blue and green. But in the warm region, we have a much richer vocabulary, red, pink, yellow, and brown. According to the language theory, English speakers should have a massive vMMN surprise response to warm color changes simply because we have so many distinct linguistic categories for them. But the results? They showed the exact opposite. The entire language theory completely fell apart right there.
So, the eureka moment for researchers was figuring out what was actually causing that brain spike in those original highly publicized studies. The modern researchers found the hidden variable. The true driver of the vMMN response wasn't linguistic categories at all. It was just low-level physical features. The original researchers had accidentally confounded complex semantic color categories with basic physical light properties.
Let's ground this massive physical difference in reality so you can see the data anomaly that explains everything. 30% versus 84%. In those original tests, the darker colors that were used had about a 30% luminance contrast against the background computer screen. The lighter colors, however, had an 84% contrast. That is a massive night and day physical difference. It's like the difference between trying to read dark gray text on a black screen versus reading bright white text. The brain wasn't getting surprised by the word for dark blue, it was having a massive asymmetric physiological reaction to a huge change in physical light contrast.
And a recent, elegantly designed study proved this using rigorous statistical testing, completely cutting through the noise. When researchers managed to actually separate these features in the data, the results were undeniable. They found incredibly strong evidence for a surprise response driven almost entirely by simple luminance contrast. But when they look specifically at categorical hue, meaning the actual color changes that are distinct to a language's vocabulary, there was absolutely no reliable response at all. The brain's surprise signal was merely reacting to visual fatigue from light and dark contrast, not to a change in vocabulary.
So the modern researchers finally resolved the anomaly. When they ran the experiment again and perfectly equated the colors for luminance contrast, meaning the light and dark shades were strictly balanced to have the exact same physical intensity against the background screen, the genuine surprise signal for categorically different hues completely vanished. The so-called magical language effect was just an optical illusion. It was basically a scientific parlor trick created by a flaw in the testing methodology.
Which brings us to this definitive conclusion from the recent papers. Quote, cognition does not automatically influence perception. The absence of early categorical effects speaks against models that predict Whorfian-type pre-attentive cognitive influences. To say it plainly, your dictionary does not edit your visual feed before you see it. There's a strict, undeniable boundary between our higher-level conscious thoughts and our raw, incoming physical senses. So let's bring this all the way back to our initial theoretical debate. This replication failure actually scored a massive victory for the sensory adaptation camp. The tired battery model perfectly explains the color contrast anomaly. Your visual neurons simply adapted differently to a 30% contrast versus an 84% contrast. Now, predictive coding definitely remains a highly respected and vital framework for understanding the brain, for sure. But this specific case forced those researchers to admit that without perfect physical controls, what looks like a brilliant top-down prediction error is often just basic bottom-up visual fatigue.
So, what are the critical takeaways here for the people in the lab? Moving forward, neuroscience has to tighten its belt. Future research must prioritize better, randomized control sequences to truly isolate complex brain predictions from basic visual fatigue. We absolutely have to perfectly disentangle physical light properties from semantic meaning, ensuring that when we test for language, we aren't just accidentally testing for brightness. And we have to thoroughly account for how luminance contrast fundamentally interacts with our eyes.
Think about that for a second. If our language doesn't actually filter our pre-attentive vision like we once thought it did, how much of your perceived reality is actually shaped by your mind, and how much is just the raw, unedited data of the physical world hitting your retinas? It's a pretty powerful reminder that while our brains are incredible prediction engines, sometimes a physical change in light is just a physical change in light. Thanks for joining me for today's explainer, and keep questioning what you see.